What would you do if the wilderness delivered a message to your doorstep? A pack of gray wolves carried a statue of the Virgin Mary to the steps of a church. The pre-dawn air in the small mountain town was still and cold, thick with a mist that clung to the pines. Against the gray stone of the church steps, the figure was stark, a life-sized carving of white marble streaked with pine needles and the dark, rich mud of the forest floor. The only sounds were the low, breathy growls of the animals and the scrape of the statue's wooden base against the concrete as they nudged it into place, their duty done. Ethan was a man made of the same silence that filled the woods he patrolled. As a ranger for the U.S. Forest Service, his uniform was a second skin, its crisp khaki a barrier between him and the rest of the world. His life was a loop of gravel roads that wound through the Superior National Forest in northern Minnesota, a landscape of immense, unforgiving beauty. The sky over Burntside Lake was a sheet of hammered silver, and the birch trees stood like pale ghosts against the dark conifers. This quiet was his sanctuary and his prison, a place where he didn't have to speak, where the only demands came from the changing seasons and the needs of the wild. His government-issued cabin was sparse, containing only a bed, a table, and the lingering scent of wood smoke and coffee. He kept the windows clean, not to let light in, but to better watch the forest, to ensure nothing and no one got too close. The town of Ely, Minnesota, was a place he drove through, never to. He bought his groceries at Zupp's food market with the efficiency of a military operation, nodding when necessary, his words rationed like water in a desert. He never went near St. Anthony's Catholic Church, a handsome brick building on the corner of North 4th Avenue East and East Harvey Street. Its steeple was a needle against the sky he refused to look at, a reminder of a conversation that had ended in silence 3 years ago. His own spiritual state was a clear-cut forest, stripped of everything that had once grown there, leaving behind only frozen, unworkable ground. The wind that swept across the iron-rich hills carried no whispers for him, only a cold that went straight through his jacket and settled deep in his bones. He measured his days in gallons of gasoline and miles of trail checked, each task a small, solid thing to hold on to in the vastness of his own interior silence. He was a steward of the land, but a stranger to the people who lived on it. The silence had not always been his own. 3 years ago, it had been imposed upon him by the screech of tires and the sudden, shocking quiet that followed. It happened on the Echo Trail, a winding ribbon of asphalt that cuts deep into the wilderness north of Ely. A patch of black ice, a moment of lost control, and the world had tilted on its axis. He remembered the flashing red and blue lights of the ambulance washing over the snow-covered pines, turning the pristine white landscape into a scene of jarring violence. He remembered the cold air burning his lungs as he knelt on the road, the metallic smell of the wreck. He remembered the paramedic's hand on his shoulder and the words that made no sense. His wife, Maria, and their 6-year-old daughter, Lily, were gone. He had prayed then, a frantic, desperate bargaining with a sky that offered back only falling snow. The silence that answered him was not peaceful. It was absolute, a void where a God was supposed to be. He had walked away from the hospital in Virginia, Minnesota, leaving behind the sterile scent of antiseptic and the sympathetic murmurs of the staff. He sold their home, packed a single bag, and took the transfer to the most remote station he could find. He had come to Ely to be swallowed by the wilderness, to let its profound indifference match his own. Every so often, a memory would break through the surface. The sound of Maria's laugh as she pointed out a soaring eagle, the weight of Lily on his shoulders as they walked a forest path, her small hand clutching a pine cone. These flashes were not comforting. They were shards of glass in his mind, and he would retreat deeper into the woods, into his work, where the past could not so easily find him. The name Maria, once a source of warmth, now felt like a brand on his heart. It was a name he had not spoken aloud in 3 years. At 5:14 a.m. on a Tuesday in late October, the streetlights of Ely, Minnesota, cast a weak yellow glow over the empty streets. Frank Peterson was starting his shift. his snowplow rumbling to life in the municipal garage. His first pass was always down Harvey Street, past St. Anthony's Catholic Church. As he turned the corner, his headlights sliced through the pre-dawn gloom, and he hit the brakes. The plow lurched to a halt in the middle of the road. His thermos of coffee slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floorboard. He saw not one, but 5 of them. A pack of gray wolves, large and healthy, their silver-tipped fur stark against the darkness. They were not running, not hunting. They moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, and between them, they were carrying something large and pale. Frank fumbled for his phone, his fingers numb and clumsy. The wolves reached the wide stone steps of the church. With careful, synchronized movements, they lowered their burden. It was a statue, white marble caked in mud and leaves, but unmistakably the Virgin Mary, her hands held out in a gesture of solace. The alpha wolf, a huge male with a dark patch over one eye, nudged the statue's base one last time, setting it perfectly upright in the center of the top step. Then, as one, the pack turned. They looked toward Frank, their yellow eyes seeming to glow in the wash of his headlights. There was no menace in their gaze, only a calm, unnerving intelligence. Then, they melted back into the shadows of the surrounding trees, disappearing as silently as they had come. Frank sat in his cab, the engine idling, his breath fogging the cold windshield. He could hear the thump of his own heart against his ribs. By 7 a.m., the news was a current running through the town. It traveled from the Plow Dispatch to the police station, then to the early morning crowd at the Front Porch Coffee and Tea Co. Whispers turned to calls, and soon a small crowd had gathered across the street from St. Anthony's, their cars parked haphazardly along the curb. They kept a respectful distance, a mixture of awe and uncertainty holding them in place. Father Michael, the parish priest, arrived, his face a mask of disbelief as he stared at the statue on his church's steps. It wasn't one of theirs. He knew every artifact in his parish. This was a stranger. That was when Sheriff Brody's cruiser pulled up, and a few minutes later so did Ethan's dark green Forest Service truck. Brody had called him, his voice strained over the phone. "Ethan, I need you down at St. Anthony's. We've got a wolf situation." Sort of. Ethan felt a familiar resistance tighten his gut. The church. He parked and walked toward the scene, his professional calm a carefully constructed shield. He ignored the statue, focusing on the tracks in the thin layer of frost on the pavement. "They're long gone, Brody," he said, his voice flat. He examined the faint drag marks on the sidewalk, the muddy paw prints on the steps. 5 of them. Big ones. Moved something heavy. He looked up at the statue for the first time, his gaze clinical. He saw the mud, the pine needles clinging to the marble folds of the robe. He saw the serene, carved face, and for a half-second, the name Maria echoed in the back of his mind. He shoved it down. "Wolves don't do this," a woman in the crowd murmured. Ethan turned. "They're scavengers, opportunists. Maybe it was stored in an old shed they broke into. They dragged things around. Carcasses, bones. This is just a weirdly shaped rock to them." He tried to make the explanation fit, but even to his own ears it sounded thin, hollow. The crowd stared at him, then back at the statue, and no one seemed to believe him. The explanation gnawed at him for the rest of the week. It wasn't right. Wolves might drag a deer carcass, but a 200-pound marble statue? The physics were wrong. The intent was wrong. Ethan found himself unable to sleep. The image of the mud-streaked statue burned into his mind. During the day, he drove the forest roads with a new, restless energy, scanning the woods not for signs of fire danger or illegal camps, but for a place where a statue might have come from. He found nothing. At night, he sat in his cabin, pulling up satellite maps on his laptop, tracing the territories of the local wolf packs. The pack from the church steps was well known to him. They roamed the dense wilderness between Shagawa Lake and the Echo Trail. There were no old homesteads, no abandoned chapels, no cemeteries in their core territory. The statue's origin was a blank. A tightness began to grow in his chest, a constant, low-grade pressure that made it hard to take a full breath. He started driving through Ely after dark, a detour he never used to make. He'd slow his truck as he passed St. Anthony's. The statue remained on the steps, and a small, informal shrine had appeared around it. People had cleaned the mud from the marble and left candles, their small flames flickering in the cold Minnesota night. The sight filled him with a profound sense of isolation, as if he were on the outside of a window, looking in at a warmth he couldn't feel. His hands had developed a slight tremor, one he noticed when he lifted his coffee mug in the morning. The forest, once a comfort, now felt like it was watching him, holding a secret it refused to share. Days later, a heavy snow began to fall, a thick, wet curtain that promised to bury the landscape. Ethan was deep in the forest, near the shore of Burntside Lake, checking on a remote monitoring station. The storm had come on faster than predicted, and by the time he was heading back, the logging road was impassable. The tires of his truck spun uselessly in the deepening drifts. He was stuck, miles from any paved road, with the snow coming down so hard he couldn't see the trees 10 feet in front of him. A cold dread began to seep in. He had a radio, supplies. He would be fine. But the isolation, the overwhelming white silence, began to press in on him. This was the same silence, the same snow from that night on the Echo Trail. He rested his head against the steering wheel, the pressure in his chest becoming an unbearable weight. And then, everything stopped. The wind died. The snow ceased its frantic swirl and began to fall in lazy, perfect flakes. An immense, profound quiet descended, a silence so deep it felt like a presence. He looked up. Standing on the road ahead, just beyond the reach of his headlights, was a wolf. It was the Alpha, the one with the dark patch over its eye. It stood perfectly still, watching him not with aggression, but with a steady, unnerving calm. At that moment, a soft, warm light began to pulse from the direction of Ely, miles away. It was a golden glow, impossible in the dead of a winter afternoon. Through the truck's vents, a scent drifted in, a smell that had no place in the frozen north, the rich, sweet fragrance of roses in full bloom. And beneath the hum of his engine, he heard a sound, faint but clear, the single, resonant toll of a church bell. From her porch on Listening Point Trail, Eleanor, a woman who had lived on the lake for 50 years, saw a soft pulse of light, like heat lightning in January, coming from the direction of the old logging road. It took him an hour to dig the truck out after the snow stopped. The wolf was gone. The light had faded, but the scent of roses lingered in the cab all the way back to town. He didn't go to his cabin. He drove straight to St. Anthony's Catholic Church, the tires of his truck crunching on the freshly plowed street. The candles around the statue were still burning, their flames cupped by glass jars. A small group of parishioners had built a simple wooden shelter over it, protecting it from the snow. Ethan got out of his truck and walked across the empty street. The cold air bit at his face. He stopped at the foot of the steps, looking up at the serene marble face, its stone eyes seeming to hold a deep, patient sorrow. For the first time in 3 years, the wall inside him began to crack. The pressure in his chest eased, replaced by a grief so sharp and clean it felt like breathing for the first time. He slowly sank to his knees in the snow. He didn't have words for a prayer. The act itself was the prayer. He took off his thick ranger's hat and held it over his heart. His head bowed. He stayed there for a long time as the sky turned a deep, bruised purple. Before he left, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object he'd carried for years. A sparrow, carved from a piece of birchwood, its wings slightly upturned. He had made it for Lily one winter afternoon. He placed the small wooden bird at the base of the statue, a silent offering left in the snow. The town began to change, not overnight, but in small, almost imperceptible ways. The story of the wolves and the statue became less a spectacle and more a quiet, centering force. A group of teenagers who usually spent their evenings aimlessly driving the town's few streets started showing up at St. Anthony's with shovels after every snowfall, silently clearing the steps and the sidewalk without being asked. At the front porch, Coffee and Tico, Two old miners who hadn't spoken in a decade over a union dispute were seen sharing a table, their conversation low and steady. Frank Peterson, the plow driver, began his route every morning by pausing for a moment in front of the church, his engine idling, his headlights illuminating the small grotto in a silent salute. People started checking on their elderly neighbors more often, leaving bags of groceries from Zups on porches without a word. The change was in Ethan, too. The deep lines of tension around his eyes softened. He started talking to his colleagues again, not just about work, but asking about their families, their weekends. One afternoon, he saw a family whose car had slid into a ditch on a slick road. Before, he would have called it in and moved on. This time, he stopped, helped them push the car out, and followed them all the way to their motel to make sure they arrived safely. He was still a man of the forest, but he was no longer a stranger to the people who lived in its shadow. Ethan's new mission was not one of grand gestures. It was quiet, steady, and rooted in the land he knew so well. He started an informal volunteer group called the Trail Guard, a network of locals with four-wheel drive vehicles who would help people stranded on the labyrinth of back roads during the harsh winters. He used his knowledge of the forest not just to manage it, but to serve the community that bordered it. He taught winter survival skills to high school students and led guided nature walks for tourists, sharing his deep, quiet respect for the wilderness. One year after the wolves came, the town dedicated a permanent grotto for the statue on the grounds of St. Anthony's. It was made of local fieldstone built by volunteers. Ethan was there, standing at the back of the crowd, comfortable in his silence. A visitor, seeing his ranger uniform, asked him about the statue and the story she'd heard. He looked at the white marble figure, now a permanent part of the town, and then toward the vast, dark woods that stretched to the horizon. "Sometimes," he said, his voice calm and sure, "the wild reminds us what's sacred." He had found a peace, not in understanding the miracle, but in the purpose it had given him. What seems like an ending is often a new beginning. A wound, once healed, does not disappear. It becomes a source of strength, a map of where we have been. The miracle in Eli was not just about a statue delivered by wolves. It was about a man and a town being led out of a long winter of the soul. It was a reminder that even in the deepest, most desolate wilderness, whether in a forest or in a human heart, grace can find a way in, arriving in a form we never could have expected. If this story touched you, like the video, subscribe to, and share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us your moment of unexpected grace in the comments.